impalement was a method of execution. But it was more than that. It was a form of torture designed to be slow. It was a public message. It was meant to inspire a unique kind of terror that other executions could not. The goal was not just to kill a person, the goal was to make their death a spectacle of suffering that would be remembered for a very long time. To understand it, you have to get rid of any modern ideas about quick, humane punishment. Impalement was the opposite of that. It was engineered for agony. There were two main ways it was done. The most common method, and the one that created the longest death, involved a long wooden stake. This stake was not necessarily sharpened to a fine point. In fact, a duller, rounded tip was often preferred. The end of the stake would be greased with oil or animal fat. The victim was forced onto the stake. It was usually inserted into the body through the perineum, the area between the genitals and the anus. The executioners had to be skilled, in a horrific way. The objective was to guide the stake up through the body cavity, carefully pushing aside the vital organs rather than piercing them. If the stake punctured the heart, the liver, or the lungs, death would come too quickly. That would defeat the purpose. The idea was to have the stake slide its way up, parallel to the spine, exiting the body near the shoulder, the neck, or sometimes the mouth. Once the person was on the stake, the pole was lifted upright and planted in the ground. And then gravity did the rest of the work. The victim's own weight would slowly, inch by inch, pull their body further down onto the stake. Every small movement, every attempt to breathe, would cause the internal pole to shift, grinding against organs and bone. Death could take hours. In some recorded cases, it took days. The person was conscious for most of it. They would die from a combination of things: shock, dehydration, blood loss from slow internal bleeding, or infection from their ruptured insides. This method was a science of pain. The greased, rounded tip was key. A sharp point would tear through tissue and organs, causing massive, rapid bleeding. A dull point pushed them aside. It created a path of destruction inside the body that allowed the person to live on, in a state of unimaginable torment. They were alive, displayed for all to see, but already dead inside. The public nature of the act was essential. This was not done in a private dungeon. It was done in the city square, along roadways, or outside the walls of a conquered city. The victims were raised up high, like flags of human misery. The other method was faster, but no less brutal. This involved driving the stake transversely through the body, from front to back or side to side. It was like spitting a piece of meat for roasting. This would almost certainly pierce vital organs, leading to a much quicker death. This might be used for mass executions, where the spectacle of a long, slow death for every single victim was not practical. But it still served the purpose of display. The body was still put on a pole, left for the birds and the elements. Imagine the scene. A field or a town square filled with these vertical poles. On top of each, a human being in their final moments. The sounds would be horrible. The screams would eventually fade into moans and whispers. The smell of blood, sweat, and waste would fill the air. For anyone who witnessed it, the image would be burned into their memory. And that was the entire point. It was a warning. It was a demonstration of absolute power. It showed what happened to those who crossed the person in charge. It turned a human body into a piece of political theater, and the script was written in pain. This was not simply killing an enemy, it was unmaking them in the most public and degrading way possible. It was a tool for breaking the will of anyone who saw it. Why would anyone choose such a method? The answer is not about efficiency. There were many faster ways to kill someone. Beheading, hanging, a simple knife to the throat. Impalement was chosen for its psychological impact. It was a weapon of terror, pure and simple. It was state-sponsored terrorism aimed at enemies and subjects alike. The message it sent was powerful and unambiguous. First, it was a message of ultimate domination. To impale someone was to exert total control over their body, their life, and their death. It was a profound act of humiliation. The victim was stripped naked, their body violated in the most intimate and painful way possible. They were then displayed like a trophy, helpless and exposed. This dehumanization was a key part of the process. The person was no longer a person. They were a thing, an object lesson. For a ruler, this demonstrated to the world that they had the power not just to end a life, but to orchestrate its ending in the most agonizing way imaginable. It said, "I own you so completely that I can make your death last for days." Second, it was a deterrent. Rulers used impalement to crush rebellion and discourage crime. A single impalement could pacify an entire town. Imagine being a peasant or a minor noble considering defying your lord. You walk to the market and see a row of stakes outside the city gates. On those stakes are the bodies of the last people who had the same idea. They are not just dead. They are grotesque sculptures of suffering, rotting in the sun. The birds are picking at them. The message is not subtle. This is your future if you disobey. The fear it created was primal. It bypassed reason and went straight to the part of the brain that understands pain and survival. It was a more effective deterrent than 1,000 laws written on paper. The act was also a performance. The execution itself was a public ritual. Crowds would gather to watch. This was not just morbid curiosity. It was often a mandatory spectacle. The ruler wanted his subjects to see it, to smell it, to hear it. He wanted them to go home and tell their children what happens to traitors. This shared trauma bonded the community in fear and obedience. The memory of the event would linger for generations, becoming a local legend, a cautionary tale. And for enemies on the battlefield, impalement was a tool of psychological warfare. A general might impale captured scouts or the first wave of attackers. Their comrades would then have to advance past the writhing bodies of their friends. It was designed to break morale, to sow panic and discord among the enemy ranks. It was a way of saying, we are not just here to defeat you in battle. We are here to bring you a kind of suffering you cannot even comprehend. It turned a conflict from a simple contest of arms into a struggle against an enemy who seemed to be a monster, capable of inhuman cruelty. There was also a cruel symbolism to it. The stake, driven up through the body, was a final, terrible assertion of power. It was a phallic, dominating act of violence that symbolically unmanned the victim. For crimes like treason or rebellion, which were seen as a betrayal of a patriarchal order, this symbolism was potent. It was the ultimate punishment for challenging the authority of the father figure, the king, the voivode, the sultan. The suffering was the point, the slowness was the point, the publicity was the point. It was not a flaw in the system, it was the system itself. Impalement was chosen because it was horrible. Its effectiveness came directly from its inhumanity. It was a cold, calculated decision to use absolute pain as an instrument of control. It worked because people are hardwired to fear suffering even more than they fear death itself. A quick death can be honorable. There is no honor in dying on a stake over 3 days. There is only agony and humiliation. When you talk about impalement, one name always comes up. Vlad the Impaler. His real name was Vlad the Third Dracula, and he was the voivode or prince of Wallachia, a region in modern-day Romania. He ruled 3 times in the mid-15th century, and while he did not invent impalement, he perfected its use as a political tool. His name became so connected with the practice that he is now almost a mythical figure, a monster from a dark fairy tale. But he was a real man, and his reasons for using impalement were very real. Vlad lived in a violent and unstable time. Wallachia was a small principality caught between 2 massive powers, the Christian Kingdom of Hungary to the north and the expanding Muslim Ottoman Empire to the south. It was a constant battle for survival. Internally, he faced constant threats from the boyars, the wealthy nobles who frequently plotted against him and had even been responsible for the deaths of his father and older brother. Vlad's world was one of betrayal, war, and shifting alliances. His cruelty was a response to that world. He used terror to forge order out of chaos. Impalement was his signature move. He used it against foreign enemies and domestic rivals with equal enthusiasm. For Vlad, it was a way to establish absolute control. He needed the boyars to fear him more than they desired power. So when a group of them plotted against him, he didn't just execute them. He invited them and their families to a feast. At the end of the meal, he had them all arrested. The older ones were impaled on the spot. The younger, healthier ones were marched off to work as slaves, rebuilding one of his castles. He wiped out entire noble families in a single night. Word of this spread quickly. The remaining boyars understood the new rules. His most famous use of impalement was against the Ottoman Turks. In 1462, the Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II, the conqueror of Constantinople, led a massive army to crush Vlad and absorb Wallachia into his empire. Vlad was severely outnumbered. He could not win a conventional, pitched battle, so he waged a campaign of guerrilla warfare and psychological terror. He conducted night raids, poisoned wells, and burned villages in the path of the Ottoman army. His goal was to demoralize and terrify them, and then came his masterpiece of horror. As Sultan Mehmed and his army advanced towards Vlad's capital, Targoviste, they came across a valley. And in that valley, they found what is now known as the Forest of the Impaled. It was a vast field, several kilometers long, filled with tens of thousands of stakes. On these stakes were the decomposing bodies of some 20,000 captured Turkish soldiers and Bulgarian collaborators. Men, women, and children were impaled. The stakes were of varying heights, supposedly to signify the rank of the victim. It was a grotesque, stinking, silent army of the dead. The sight was so horrifying that even the battle-hardened Ottoman army was shaken to its core. The Sultan himself, a man known for his own ruthlessness, was reportedly stunned into silence, admitting that he could not conquer a man capable of such acts. While the Ottomans eventually took the capital, the campaign was a psychological disaster. The forest of the impaled broke their spirit. It was not just a massacre, it was a work of art, a horrifying installation designed to communicate a single, powerful message. This is what I do to my enemies. Turn back. Stories of Vlad's cruelty became legend. German and Russian pamphlets, the mass media of the day, spread tales of his atrocities across Europe. Well, they told stories of him dining amidst the impaled, dipping his bread in their blood. They said he impaled unfaithful wives, lazy merchants, and poor people who were a drain on society. He once supposedly encountered two monks who, when asked what they thought of his justice, gave different answers. One said he was a harsh but just ruler, the other condemned him. He impaled the critical monk for his honesty and rewarded the other for his sycophancy before impaling him too, so he could join his friend in heaven. Most of these stories are likely exaggerations, propaganda spread by his enemies. The story of him dipping bread in blood is almost certainly a fiction that later helped inspire the Dracula vampire myth. But the core truth remains. Vlad the Impaler used impalement on a massive scale. For him, it was not just a punishment. It was the central pillar of his foreign and domestic policy. He ruled through fear, and the stake was his scepter. He secured his throne and defended his homeland using the most brutal tool he had at his disposal, and in doing so, he carved his name into history as the master of the impaled. Vlad the Impaler may be the most famous practitioner of impalement, but he was far from the only one. The practice is ancient, and it was used by many cultures long before and long after his time. It was not a uniquely Romanian or even a uniquely European form of cruelty. It was a tool of terror that appeared in different parts of the world, used by rulers who wanted to make a statement. The origins of impalement can be traced back to the ancient Near East. The Assyrian Empire, which flourished in Mesopotamia from around 2500 BC to 600 BC, was notorious for its brutality. They were masters of psychological warfare, and they used impalement to terrorize conquered peoples. We know this because they left detailed records. Carved stone reliefs from Assyrian palaces like those of King Ashurnasirpal II explicitly show these scenes. The carvings depict prisoners being impaled on stakes outside the walls of a captured city. The Assyrians didn't hide their cruelty. They advertised it. It was a key part of their imperial strategy. It sent a clear message to other cities in their path surrender, or this'll be you. The practice was also used by the Achaemenid Empire of Persia. The ancient Greek historian Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BC, describes how King Darius the Great dealt with a rebellion in Babylon. After conquering the city, Darius had around 3,000 of its leading citizens impaled. This was a calculated act to crush the spirit of the Babylonians and ensure they would never rebel again. It was a common tool for maintaining control over a vast and diverse empire. The Roman Empire, while famous for crucifixion, also used impalement on occasion, though it was less common. It was sometimes referred to as crux simplex, a simple cross or stake. It was reserved for the most despised criminals, particularly rebellious slaves or prisoners of war from what they considered barbaric lands. The goal was the same as slow, agonizing, and humiliating public death. Within medieval Europe itself, impalement was not a standard form of execution in most kingdoms, like England or France. They preferred hanging, drawing, and quartering, or breaking on the wheel, but it was not unheard of, especially in Central and Eastern Europe. The Holy Roman Empire had laws that prescribed impalement for certain crimes, particularly for women who had committed infanticide. It was seen as a punishment of unique severity, reserved for crimes that were considered especially unnatural or heinous. The Ottoman Empire, Vlad's great enemy, also practiced impalement. This is a crucial piece of context. Vlad did not learn this technique in a vacuum. He learned it from his enemies. As a young man, he and his brother were held as political hostages at the Ottoman court. There, he would have seen the Ottoman system of justice firsthand. The Ottomans used impalement to punish traitors, spies, and rebels. So when Vlad later used it against them, he was, in a sense, speaking their language. He was turning their own weapon of terror back on them, but on a scale they had never seen before. This irony was likely not lost on either side. In other parts of the world, similar practices existed. In 16th century Japan, a form of impalement known as haritsuke was used, though it was more akin to crucifixion on a cross, followed by a spear thrust to end the suffering. In parts of Africa and Asia, tales of impalement as a punishment for severe crimes also exist in historical records and folklore. What this shows is that impalement was not the invention of one madman or one sadistic culture. It was a recurring solution to the problem of how to instill maximum fear and control. Different civilizations, separated by thousands of years and thousands of miles, independently arrived at the same gruesome conclusion. When a ruler needs to make an example of someone, when they need to terrorize a population into submission, putting a person on a stake is a brutally effective way to do it. It is a dark thread that runs through human history, a testament to the fact that when it comes to power and fear, cruelty can be a universal language. Vlad the Impaler was not an anomaly. He was just the most prolific artist in a very old and very dark tradition. Like all things, the age of impalement as a formal method of execution came to an end. It did not disappear overnight, but over centuries its use declined until it vanished from the law books of nations. The reasons for its disappearance are tied to broader changes in society, warfare, and ideas about justice. The Enlightenment in the 17th to 18th centuries played a big role. Thinkers like Cesare Beccaria in Italy and Voltaire in France began to argue against cruel and unusual punishment. They promoted the idea that the purpose of punishment was not to inflict theatrical suffering, but to be a rational deterrent. They argued that a swift and certain punishment was more effective than a slow and barbaric one. Public torture and execution came to be seen as a sign of a backward, tyrannical state, not a strong one. These ideas slowly spread across Europe, influencing monarchs and legal reformers. Impalement, along with practices like breaking on the wheel, was one of the first things to be condemned as excessively barbaric. The warfare also changed. The rise of gunpowder and large, disciplined armies made the kind of psychological warfare Vlad practiced less central. While terror was still a part of war, the focus shifted to more organized, large-scale conflict. The ritualistic display of a few thousand impaled bodies was replaced by the impersonal slaughter of cannons and muskets. The nature of state power was changing. Rulers began to build their authority on bureaucracy, taxation, and standing armies rather than on raw personal terror. A modern state did not need to put bodies on stakes to prove its power. It could do so with its laws and its institutions. So, the practice faded from official use. It became a relic of a darker age. But it did not disappear from the human imagination. Impalement's very horror ensured its survival as a potent symbol. It came to represent the absolute worst of human cruelty, the ultimate expression of sadistic power. It became a shorthand for evil. This legacy is most obvious in the story of Dracula. In the late 19th century, the Irish writer Bram Stoker was researching Eastern European history for his new novel. He came across the name Dracula and read about the atrocities of the historical Vlad the Impaler. He borrowed the name and the aura of Balkan cruelty for his vampire count. While Stoker's Dracula doesn't impale people, the historical memory of Vlad's violence gives the character his dark, aristocratic menace. The vampire's evil is rooted in the real-world evil of the voivode. The stake, the very instrument of Vlad's terror, was transformed in the novel into the only weapon that could destroy the monster. It's a powerful literary irony. Beyond Dracula, impalement has haunted our art and culture. The 16th century painter Peter Bruegel the Elder depicted scenes of impalement in his hellish landscapes like the triumph of death, using it to show a world overrun by chaos and damnation. In modern times, it appears in horror movies and fantasy epics whenever a creator wants to portray a truly ruthless villain or a barbaric regime. It is a visual cue that tells the audience that we are dealing with a form of evil that has no limits. The act itself has tragically, not vanished from the world entirely. In times of genocide and extreme conflict, there have been sporadic reports of impalement, like atrocities being committed by paramilitaries or warlords. These are not state-sanctioned executions, but acts of chaotic, savage violence. It serves as a grim reminder that the capacity for such cruelty is not confined to the medieval past. Impalement is no longer on the law books. No government today formally sentences criminals to death by stake. But its shadow remains. It exists as a historical warning. It shows what can happen when power is absolute and unchecked. It demonstrates how fear can be weaponized, how the human body can be turned into a political statement. It is a gruesome chapter in our history, but an important one. It reminds us of the depths of calculated cruelty humans are capable of, and it serves as a benchmark against which we measure our own progress, or lack thereof, in creating a more just and humane world. The stakes may be gone from the city squares, but the memory of what they stood for should not be forgotten.